Today on the Perception in Action podcast, what is the optimal spacing of training sessions to promote acquisition of a new skill? How does it depend on the task complexity and intensity? What underlying processes are involved? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at the issue of spacing in training. How often should you practice a new sports skill? 3 times a day? Once a day? How is it influenced by the intensity of practice? For example, whether you practice for 1 hour per session or 3 hours. What processes are occurring when we space out training sessions? Let's have a look at a couple recent articles that have addressed this topic. The first article I want to look at today was a paper published by Smith and Scarf in Frontiers in Psychology in 2017. The goal of this paper was to review and provide a theoretical explanation for the so-called spacing effect, which is the general finding that practice spaced in time, often called distributed practice, tends to produce better learning and retention of skills as opposed to practice that is not spaced, often called massed practice. Note here that this effect applies generally to a broad range of things, including memory and verbal skills. But for our purposes today, I'm just going to be looking at perceptual motor skills. For sports skills, studies which have investigated spacing effects have typically compared a group that completes all the training within 1 day, the massed group, with a group that does the same amount of practice but spaced across multiple days, the distributed group. An example of this is a study by Dahl and Christina published in 2004. This study involved practicing golf putting with 45 participants in the massed group, performing 240 putts all in one session, and 45 participants in the distributed group, performing 60 putts on 4 consecutive days. 15 participants of each group returned for a retention test 1 later, 15 returned 7 days later, and 15 participants per group returned 28 days later. Participants were given a putting score based on how many putts were holed and how far away their misses ended up. They were also asked to predict how well they would perform in the retention tests. What was found? During the acquisition phase, there was no significant difference in performance between the massed and distributed groups, with both showing steady improvements in performance. Interestingly, participants in the massed group consistently predicted they would do worse than those in the distributed group. But the most interesting results of the study, of course, come when we look at the retention trials. At 1, 7, and 28 days after training, the distributed group scored significantly better, with an average score of 37 where lower is better, than the massed group with an average score of 48. So performing the same amount of golf training spaced over 4 days results in significantly better motor learning than training performed all in one block. Another way in which spaced training seems to benefit is in terms of transfer or generalization of skills. For example, in 1980, Hagman had participants learn and practice an electrical testing task on the same equipment or on different sets of equipment, with practice massed all in 1 day or spaced on 3 consecutive days. On a transfer test after a 2-week delay, spaced practice on the different equipment resulted in better transfer than spaced practice on the same equipment. This makes sense, of course. Having some variability in practice, using different sets of equipment, resulted in better transfer of the skill. However, interestingly, this did not occur for the massed group. That is, transfer performance was the same for participants that did massed practice with the same equipment as those that did massed practice with different sets of equipment. Thus, it seems that spacing in training is required to reap the benefits of variability of practice. I will return to this issue in a bit. But next, I want to look at some factors that seem to influence this basic spacing effect. One factor that a small number of studies have looked at is the intensity of training. For example, is 1 hour of training per day for 16 days better than more intense 4 hours of training per day for 4 days? In 1978, Badley and Longman addressed this question by varying the number of sessions per day, either 1 or 2, and the number of hours in each session, either 1 or 2, for participants that were trained to type. After approximately 60 hours of training, participants who completed the least intense training, one session of 1 hour per day, learned to type faster and more accurately than the other more intense groups. Thus, it seems that less intense training, spread across a large number of days, provides better learning. However, further research investigating this issue has shown that the relationship between intensity and learning is a U-shaped function, with either too high or too low intensity resulting in worse learning. For example, it has been shown that 8 sessions spaced over 2 weeks can lead to slower acquisition than 8 spaced over 1. Studies investigating perceptual and visual motor learning have found that a minimum number of trials is required for learning to occur, that there is an optimal number of trials per day for learning, and going beyond the optimum produces minimal additional learning effects. This, of course, connects pretty well with the challenge point hypothesis, which I discussed back in episode 105. An intermediate level of intensity appears to be best for motor learning. Another factor that seems to influence the spacing effect is the amount of previous experience participants have with the skill being trained. In an interesting PhD dissertation published in 1954, Young compared college students' ability to learn archery and badminton while training either 2 or 4 days per week. For badminton, the basic spacing effect was found. That is, participants improved more when they practiced 2 days per week as compared to 4 days per week. In contrast, the archery task showed the exact opposite effect. Participants improved more when they practiced 4 days per week than when they did 2. The authors speculated that the results were due to the differences in participants' prior experience with the skills related to the two sports. Many participants had prior experience in racket sports, and this meant they could improve their badminton skill with relatively spaced sessions. But for archery, they required more concentrated sessions to build up their basic skills, which they did not start with. This idea is also consistent with the results of a study by Harmon and Miller published in 1950. In this study, college women who had no experience playing billiards practiced with different schedules for a total of 9 sessions. They compared 4 different schedules. Group 1 completed 3 sessions per week for 3 weeks. Group 2 completed the 9 sessions across 9 consecutive days. Group 3 completed sessions across a gradually increasing interval. That is, they practiced on day 1, 2, and 3, then 5, then 8, then 13, then 21, and then finally 34. And finally, Group 4 completed 1 session per week for 9 weeks. At the end of training, Group 3 performed significantly better than the other 3 groups. The authors attributed the better performance of Group 3 to participants initially benefiting from concentrating their sessions to reach a certain threshold of learning, and then benefiting from the spacing of sessions afterwards to further improve performance. A final factor that seems to mediate the spacing effect is task complexity. In a review of the literature, tasks which are more complex tend to show less benefits of spacing as compared to the typical ones used in laboratory experiments. Note this is similar to what we see with random versus block training and contextual interference, which I discussed back in episode 91. I will talk more about the parallels between these two bodies of research in a second. However, it should be noted that a reason we may have not seen benefits of spacing for complex tasks is that we haven't been measuring performance over a long enough duration. In an interesting study published recently by Casabona and colleagues in the journal Applied Sciences, the authors note that the majority of studies conducted in this area of spaced learning adopt training paradigms where the performance stabilizes after a relatively low number of repetitions. Thus, the most common outcome in the relevant literature is that the effective spacing appears early after the first session of training. However, many sports skills and sports activities require extensive practice with multiple training sessions before the performance stabilizes. In these cases, the authors propose that the benefits from spaced training may be delayed over the course of the learning period. To test this, the authors trained 16 participants to make a precision underarm throw with a tennis ball. Each participant performed 1,020 trials, equally divided over 4 sessions of training. One group performed the training session with breaks of 40 minutes in between, whereas the other group spaced the practice sessions with intervals of 1 day in between. 15 days after the last training session, both groups executed 1 additional session of 255 throws to test long-term memory retention. Radial error was used as the measure of performance. What was found? Early in training, going from session 1 to 2, the decrease in radial error was significantly larger for the masked 40-minute group, as compared to the distributed 1-day group. After session 2, however, this effect completely reversed, with the distributed group showing a greater decrease in error. Thus, consistent with the author's proposal, for a more complex task, the benefits from the spaced practice were delayed over the learning sessions, with significant performance improvements at the end of training and during the memory retention test, but not after the first couple sessions. The authors argue that the offline gains that occur with spacing may only be triggered after the amount of practice ensures a relatively stable outcome, and this will of course occur later for more complex tasks. For tasks requiring a relatively low number of sensory and motor components, such as finger tapping or reaction time skills, the performance may stabilize during the first training session. In a case of more complex tasks, a higher number of repetitions may be required to obtain a stable performance, with the consequence of a delay in the appearance of the offline gains. So why does this spacing effect occur? And can we explain why it's modified by factors like intensity, complexity, and previous experience? Prior to this article by Smith and Scarf, there were two main theories proposed to explain spacing effects. The first is contextual or encoding variability theories. These theories suggest that spaced repetitions lead to greater variety of contextual elements being integrated into a memory than masked repetitions. And a greater variety of contextual elements means that the memory is more likely to be recalled after a delay period. Note that this is highly similar to the elaboration hypothesis proposed by Shea and Morgan to explain the difference between blocked versus random practice in variability of practice research. The idea is that by spacing training, much like randomizing training, you're going to necessarily be practicing in different contexts. For example, the weather might be slightly different each day, you might have different teammates, the equipment might differ, etc. This results in a richer, more elaborate motor skill. The second major class of theories explains the benefits of spacing in terms of retrieval difficulty. In particular, these theories suggest that greater forgetting occurs for spaced repetitions, and this makes retrieval more difficult, leading to greater enhancement in the memory. Note that this is essentially identical to the reconstruction hypothesis proposed by Lee and Magel to explain random versus blocked effects. The idea in both cases is that having to rebuild your motor program after being away from the skill for a while enhances learning in the long run. The authors of this current paper argue that neither of these does an adequate job of explaining the moderating factors I've been discussing. In particular, why for learners really new to a skill, there seems to be a benefit for initial masked practice. As an alternative, they propose a reconsolidation account of the spacing effect. Reconsolidation is the idea I talked about a little bit back in episode 121. The dominant perspective for a long time about how memories are formed, both declarative and procedural, is that they are initially unstable and then consolidate or strengthen over time in pretty much a linear manner. More recently, it has been argued that this is not correct. Instead, after this initial consolidation period when a memory is retrieved, it is returned to being in an unstable state, sensitive to disruption. This period of instability probably provides a net benefit, as it's necessary for additional experiences to modify and build on the pre-existing memory trace. That is, even a well-learned skill can be reconsolidated and strengthened with the right types of experience. One really interesting way researchers have provided evidence for this is by using protein synthesis inhibitors. Research has shown that when a memory was retrieved, injecting protein synthesis inhibitors into brain areas associated with the memory disrupt the memory after 24 hours, but not when it's tested a few hours after training. Thus, a short-term memory could be sustained for a few hours without generating new proteins, but new proteins are needed for long-term memory. A second development in memory consolidation research is a much better understanding of the significance of sleep. Similar to the reconsolidation literature, studies investigating sleep and learning indicate that consolidation during sleep is influenced by the same dependent variables, learning and retention, as the spacing effect, and sleep, like the spacing effect, requires time to influence these variables. In their paper, Smith and Scarf propose that the greater time between training sessions provides more time for the memory to consolidate, And this greater degree of consolidation makes the reconsolidation induced by additional practice more effective at enhancing the memory. Furthermore, part of this reconsolidation process is further processing the memory during sleep. For learning, spacing enables some initial learning to consolidate, and then when the skill is repeated later, the reconsolidation process can more effectively integrate and consolidate additional learning, thus building on the earlier consolidation process. For retention, spacing enables the memory to consolidate, and then subsequent reconsolidation processing is more effective at enhancing the memory, making it more durable. This explains why the initial skill level of a performer is a mediating factor. When there's no previous experience with a task, more effort is needed to initially consolidate the skill so that spacing will be more effective later on. So to sum up today's episode, here are a few take-home messages about spacing practice sessions. Research has clearly shown that spacing out practice sessions is generally better than massed practice, so this should be used as a basic guiding principle. However, there are a few important caveats. For really novice learners and highly complex skills, there may be some benefits to initial massed practice to allow for initial consolidation processes to occur. It seems like only after this stage do the benefits of spacing take effect. The effect of task intensity also needs to be considered when developing a spacing schedule, again aiming for that intermediate zone. Finally, referring back to the study I talked about in episode 121, it appears that the reconsolidation process prompted by spacing of training only occurs when some variability is added to the training session. Pure repetition of the same skill, no matter how it is spaced, does not trigger this process. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including an extra monthly episode and written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.